On July 30th, 1945, a United States Navy heavy cruiser sank in 12 minutes. 900 men went into the water. For the next 4 days, no one came looking for them. Not because the ship had vanished without a trace. A distress signal was received. 3 separate naval stations logged it. Not one of them acted on it. The ship itself had been due into port on July 31st. It never arrived. No one at Naval Intelligence noticed. No one at the Philippine Sea frontier noticed. For 4 days, 900 sailors floated in open ocean, hunted by sharks, drinking seawater, waiting for a rescue that no one back on land knew to send. Only 316 of them survived. USS Indianapolis had just completed the most classified naval mission of the Second World War, delivering the components of the atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. 10 days later, Japan surrendered. The war that the ship had helped end was over, but the United States Navy still needed an answer for 900 dead men. It found one, not in its own broken tracking systems, not in the officers who ignored a distress call. It found one man, the ship's captain, the only commanding officer in the entire war, court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. His name was Charles Butler McVay III. In the last week of July 1945, a warship left San Francisco carrying cargo its own crew had not been told about. USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, had spent most of the Pacific War escorting carrier task forces and shelling enemy positions from Attu to Okinawa. She had survived kamikaze strikes. She had survived years of frontline combat. On July 16, 1945, she took on a new kind of cargo at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, a 15-foot crate lashed to the deck, and a lead-lined bucket carried below by 2 Army officers who never let it out of their sight. Inside the crate, components of the bomb casing for Little Boy. Inside the bucket, roughly half the world's supply of enriched uranium-235. The crew was told nothing. Rumors moved through the ship anyway, that the cargo was worth more than the ship itself, that the 2 Army officers had standing orders to go down with it if the vessel was ever hit. Neither rumor was far from the truth. What the crew did understand was the timetable. Indianapolis was ordered to make the 5,000-mile run to Tinian, at a speed that would set a wartime record for a ship her size. And she did it, arriving on July 26th, 10 days after leaving San Francisco. The mission had a name and a purpose the crew would not learn until after the war ended. They had just delivered the material for the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima 10 days later. Command of the ship rested with Captain Charles Butler McVay III. 46 years old, a career naval officer and the son of an admiral. McVay had taken command of Indianapolis in November 1944, inheriting a decorated ship in the middle of the largest naval campaign in American history. By the summer of 1945, he had commanded her through some of the war's heaviest fighting, including a kamikaze strike off Okinawa in March that killed 9 of his men and forced the ship back to California for repairs. I was, by every account in his personnel file, a competent and careful officer, not a man known for recklessness, and not a man who had ever lost a ship. With the Tinian delivery complete, Indianapolis was released for what should have been a routine transit. Her new orders sent her to Guam, and from there to Leyte in the Philippines, to join the battleship USS Idaho, and begin gunnery training ahead of the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. It was, on paper, the least dangerous leg of the entire mission. The classified cargo was gone. The war, though no one aboard the ship knew it yet, had 2 days left to run. At Guam, McVay requested an escort for the run to Leyte, standard practice for a capital ship transiting open water. He was told none was available, and none was necessary. The sea route to Leyte, he was informed, was considered safe. That assessment was wrong. It was also not McVay's assessment to make. It came from officers ashore, working from intelligence reports that, as later investigation would show, had failed to reach him in full. On July 28th, Indianapolis departed Guam alone, on a course that would take her directly across a stretch of the Philippine Sea that Japanese submarines were, at that very moment, actively patrolling. No destroyers screened her flanks. No aircraft swept the water ahead of her bow. She was a single heavy cruiser, unescorted, carrying 1,195 men. Moving through waters the United States Navy itself did not fully understand were dangerous. 2 days out from Guam, on the night of July 29th, a Japanese submarine designated I-58 was running on the surface roughly 100 miles from Indianapolis's plotted course, its commander scanning open water through a periscope, waiting for exactly this kind of target to appear. The decision not to escort Indianapolis was not made by one villain in one room. It was made by a system functioning exactly as it was designed to function, and that system had a blind spot large enough to swallow a warship whole. By the summer of 1945, U.S. Navy doctrine held that heavy cruisers routinely transited the Philippine Sea without escort. The logic was sound on its surface. American naval and air power had crushed Japan's surface fleet by mid-1945, and the remaining threat was assumed to be minimal on interior transit routes. Requests for escorts were evaluated against a simple calculus. Available destroyers were scarce, needed for the invasion buildup, and could not be spared for every transiting vessel, unless intelligence flagged a specific credible threat. The intelligence existed. It simply never reached the man who needed it. Naval codebreakers had, in fact, intercepted signals suggesting Japanese submarine activity along the Petty route, the exact corridor Indianapolis had been ordered to sail. That information sat inside ultra-intelligence channels, classified at a level so restricted that most fleet commanders, let alone a single ship's captain, were never briefed on its contents. The officers who denied McVay's escort request at Guam were not lying to him. They were working from an incomplete picture, because the Navy's own compartmentalization of intelligence had made a complete picture impossible to assemble. 3 ships had already been lost or damaged by Japanese submarines in that same stretch of ocean in the preceding weeks. McVay was told about none of them. This was the first crack in a system that would fail Indianapolis twice, once in failing to warn her, and again, days later, in failing to notice she was gone. Waiting in that same stretch of water was a Japanese submarine that, by every reasonable measure, should not have posed much of a threat at all. I-58 was a Type B-3 submarine of the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanded by 34-year-old Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. By late July 1945, Japan's submarine force was a fraction of what it had been at the war's start. Starved of fuel, hunted relentlessly by American destroyers and aircraft, reduced to a handful of boats still capable of offensive patrol. I-58 was one of them, armed with 6 forward torpedo tubes, and carrying, in addition to conventional torpedoes, a small number of Chiton, piloted suicide torpedoes designed for exactly this kind of hunt. Hashimoto did not need the Chiton that night. On the surface shortly after 11 o'clock p.m. on July 29th, running on batteries to recharge and scanning the dark water through his periscope, he sighted what his crew would later describe as a large, unescorted vessel silhouetted against the moonlight, moving in a straight line, no zigzag pattern, no screening ships anywhere in sight. For a submarine commander starved of targets for months, it was close to a gift. Hashimoto brought I-58 into firing position, ordered his tubes readied, and waited for the range to close. At 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, Hashimoto gave the order to fire 6 torpedoes in a spread. Aboard Indianapolis, most of the crew was asleep, less than 15 hours from an ordinary, uneventful arrival at Leyte. They would never make it. 2 torpedoes struck Indianapolis within seconds of each other. Just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, the first hit the bow, tearing away roughly 65 feet of the ship's forward hull in a single detonation. The second struck near the midship, close to a fuel tank and a powder magazine, igniting a chain of explosions that tore upward through multiple decks at once. Within moments, the ship that had survived kamikaze strikes off Okinawa, that had carried the components of the atomic bomb across 5,000 miles of open ocean without incident, was taking on water faster than any damage control team could contain. The bow section, severed and useless, began dragging beneath the waves almost immediately, pulling the ship's forward momentum downward like an anchor. Communications lines were among the first casualties. Below decks, in the radio room, operators fought to get a distress signal out through failing power and rapidly flooding compartments, while above them the ship's list grew from a lean to a roll within minutes. There was no time for an orderly evacuation. Compartments that had not flooded outright lost power and lighting almost immediately, leaving sailors to navigate smoke-filled passageways in total darkness, feeling along bulkheads for a way up and out before the rising water sealed it. Men who had been asleep in their bunks woke to alarms, explosions, and the sudden sickening sensation of the deck tilting beneath them. Indianapolis went down bow first, rolling onto her side as she sank, in 12 minutes. 12 minutes is not enough time to launch most lifeboats in any organized fashion. It is barely enough time to reach a topside deck from below, let alone lower a boat, secure supplies, and account for a crew of nearly 1,200 men. What went into the water in those 12 minutes went in largely as it was. Men in whatever they had been wearing when the first torpedo hit. Some in life jackets grabbed on the way up. Many with nothing at all, scrambling over a hull that was rolling out from under them even as they tried to jump clear. Of the 1,195 men aboard, an estimated 300 died in the initial attack and sinking, killed by the explosions themselves, trapped below decks as compartments flooded, or lost in the chaos of a ship rolling over in the dark. That left roughly 890 men in the water. When Indianapolis finally slipped beneath the surface, scattered across a stretch of open ocean, most without proper flotation, many without any life jacket at all, in the middle of the night, 500 miles from the nearest land. They had gone down fast enough, and unexpectedly enough, that only a handful of the ship's life rafts had been successfully launched. What survived, floating loose in the debris field, was a patchwork. A few rafts, some cargo netting, isolated clusters of men clinging to floating wreckage, kapok life jackets that would, within days, begin to fail as their buoyant fibers waterlogged and lost their lift. In the radio room, before the ship went down, at least one distress call had gone out, a standard SOS, giving position and stating the ship was sinking. Whether it was fully received and by whom would become one of the most consequential and disputed questions of the entire disaster. What is not disputed is what happened next. Nothing. No rescue ship changed course. No aircraft was scrambled. No one on land yet understood that a United States Navy heavy cruiser and nearly 900 of her crew were now adrift in the open Pacific, with no one coming. As dawn broke on July 30th, the men of Indianapolis found themselves spread across miles of ocean in scattered groups. Some clustered together in the low hundreds, others alone or in pairs, holding on to whatever had stayed afloat. Fuel oil coated the surface of the water and the men themselves, burning their eyes and stinging open wounds. The Pacific sun was already rising toward a heat that would blister exposed skin within hours. They believed, every one of them, that help was coming. Indianapolis was overdue at Leyte. Someone, they assumed, would notice. No one did. Not for 4 days. 5. The distress signal that went out from Indianapolis in her final minutes was not lost to static, or swallowed by a storm, or garbled beyond recognition. It was received. That is the detail that turns this from a story of wartime bad luck into a story of institutional failure. Post-war investigation established that at least 3 separate naval stations in the Philippine Sea frontier picked up the SOS transmitted as Indianapolis went down. One related to a duty officer who was reportedly asleep and left orders not to be disturbed. A second dismissed it, believing it might be a Japanese deception intended to lure an American rescue vessel into a submarine trap. A real tactic, but one applied here to a genuine distress call from a genuine sinking ship. A third simply failed to act on it through what post-war inquiry could only describe as negligence, with no clear individual explanation ever fully established. None of the 3 escalated the signal. None of them cross-checked it against Indianapolis's known position or schedule. The message that should have launched an immediate search and rescue operation instead disappeared into paperwork. assumption, and inaction. That failure alone might have been survivable if a second layer of the system had caught the mistake. It did not. The Navy, in 1945, operated what was known as the Movement Report System, a procedure by which combat ships were tracked across the Pacific, their expected arrival times logged, and their actual arrivals confirmed against that schedule. On paper, it was a safety net specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of situation: a ship that failed to reach its destination on time. Indianapolis was due into Leyte on the morning of July 31st. She never arrived. No one at the Philippine Sea frontier flagged the absence. No one at the port director's office in Leyte raised an alarm when the ship failed to appear on schedule. The official explanation, reconstructed after the fact, revealed a system riddled with institutional loopholes. Combatant ships, unlike supply vessels, were not always required to be reported overdue, on the theory that a warship's movements were more fluid and less predictable than a cargo ship's fixed schedule. Some officers assumed another command was tracking the ship. Others assumed Indianapolis had simply been rerouted without their knowledge, a plausible enough occurrence in the final chaotic weeks of the war that no one thought to question it. Each individual assumption was, in isolation, defensible. Together they formed a chain of nobody's job, a gap in accountability so complete that a heavy cruiser and nearly 900 men could vanish from the face of the Pacific Ocean and trigger no institutional response whatsoever. This is the detail that separates the Indianapolis story from an ordinary wartime tragedy. Ships were lost in combat throughout the Pacific War. Men died in the water waiting for rescue and other engagements too. What set Indianapolis apart was that the mechanism specifically built to prevent exactly this outcome, a distress signal received, a scheduled arrival tracked, existed, functioned as designed at the point of transmission, and still failed entirely at every subsequent link in the chain. For 4 days, nearly 900 men floated in the open Pacific believing that the system they had trusted their entire careers to was already working to find them. It was not. No search aircraft had been dispatched. No destroyer had been redirected. As far as the official record of the United States Navy was concerned, USS Indianapolis was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She was in fact gone, along with the only signal that had ever announced it, by the first light of July 31st. The survivors of Indianapolis had organized, as much as scattered men in open water could organize, into loose clusters, some numbering in the low hundreds, others no more than a handful clinging to a single piece of debris. There was no unified command. Officers and enlisted men alike drifted according to where the currents in the wreckage had carried them. Many with no life raft at all, kept afloat only by kapok life jackets that were already, within the first 24 hours, beginning to fail. The kapok vests issued to the crew were rated for about 48 hours of reliable buoyancy. By the second day, the natural fibers had begun to waterlog, adding weight rather than lift, and men who had trusted them without a second thought now found themselves fighting simply to keep their heads above the surface. Some removed the vests to swim more freely and drowned within hours. Others held on, exhausted, as the vests slowly dragged them lower in the water. Thirst set in almost immediately, and it proved far more dangerous than hunger. Surrounded by water on every side with none of it drinkable, men began by the second day to give in to the temptation to drink from the ocean itself. Seawater accelerates dehydration rather than relieving it, and within hours of drinking it, survivors began to show the effects: confusion, hallucination, and in the most severe cases, a violent psychosis that made them dangerous to the men around them. Sailors who had shared jokes and rations the day before began attacking their own shipmates, convinced in their delirium that rescue ships were near, or that enemies were hiding beneath the surface, or that the men beside them were something other than what they were. Then came the sharks, oceanic white-tip sharks, drawn first by the blood and fuel oil in the water, and then, over the following days, by the presence of hundreds of exhausted, motionless bodies, began circling the largest groups of survivors, almost from the first day. Attacks were, according to survivor accounts and later historical analysis, initially sporadic, isolated incidents involving men who had drifted alone or fallen unconscious at the edge of a group. By the second and third days, as exhaustion spread and more men slipped beneath the surface or drifted into open water alone, the frequency increased. Survivors described watching men disappear beneath the surface in the middle of a group, pulled under without warning, the water briefly churning before going still again. The exact number of men killed by shark attacks during the ordeal has never been precisely established and remains disputed among historians. What is not disputed is that it remains, by most historical accounts, among the deadliest documented instances of shark attacks on humans in recorded history. By the third day, the sun itself had become as dangerous as the water below. Men who had been in the ocean for nearly 72 hours without shelter suffered severe sunburn, and, in many cases, skin that blistered and split from prolonged saltwater exposure. Some survivors, driven past the point of rational thought by thirst, dehydration, and exhaustion, began to hallucinate rescue ships that did not exist, islands that were not there, and in the most tragic cases, swam toward these illusions until they drowned, chasing something that had never been real. Groups fractured under the strain. Men who had entered the water as a single body of nearly 900 survivors were, by the third day, spread across miles of open ocean in smaller and smaller clusters, many too weak to signal for help, even if a rescue plane had passed directly overhead. Officers among the survivors, including some of the ship's most senior surviving crew, worked to hold groups together, to enforce what discipline they could to prevent men from drinking seawater or swimming off alone. But exhaustion and the sheer scale of the disaster made it an impossible task to sustain uniformly across a very scattered cluster. Throughout all 4 days, not a single search aircraft passed overhead looking for them. Not a single ship altered course to search the water. As far as any record on land showed, there was nothing to search for. By the morning of August 2nd, nearly 4 full days after the sinking, the men who remained alive numbered a fraction of those who had gone into the water. Many had died of exposure, dehydration, or shark attack. Some had simply slipped beneath the surface in their sleep, too exhausted to keep their heads above water any longer. The survivors who remained were, by this point, in the final stages of what their bodies could endure. Barely conscious, severely dehydrated, sunburned past the point of visible skin, and increasingly resigned to a rescue that seemed, by every indication available to them, never going to come. It would take, in the end, an accident, not a search, not a system, not a single act of institutional recognition, to change that. At approximately 10:25 a.m. on August 2, 1945, a Navy PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol thousands of feet above a stretch of open Pacific that no search order had ever designated as significant. Gwynn was not looking for survivors. He was not looking for Indianapolis. As far as any record aboard his aircraft indicated, there was nothing beneath him worth searching for at all. What drew his attention was mechanical, not intentional. A trailing wire antenna beneath his aircraft had begun malfunctioning, and in moving to the rear of the plane to investigate the fault, Gwynn happened to look down through a window at the ocean surface below. What he saw was a long, dark slick spreading across the water, the kind of oil trail that could indicate a submarine, and worth investigating on that basis alone. He brought the Ventura down for a closer look, and as the aircraft descended, the slick resolved into something else entirely. Dozens, then scores, then what appeared to be over 100 human heads bobbing in the open water, scattered across a wide expanse of ocean, waving weakly, or simply floating motionless. Gwynn radioed an emergency report back to base, describing what he estimated to be some 150 survivors adrift with no vessel in sight, and requested an immediate rescue response. It was the first indication, in any form, that reached any American command post that USS Indianapolis had gone down at all. 4 days after she sank, and 4 days after her distress signal had gone unanswered, within hours a second PBY Catalina seaplane, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, was dispatched to the scene, followed by additional aircraft and surface ships redirected at maximum speed. Marks, arriving over the survivors and witnessing men being attacked by sharks in real time, made the decision to break standard operating procedure and land his aircraft directly on the open ocean, a maneuver considered extremely hazardous in swells of that size, in order to begin pulling survivors from the water immediately, rather than waiting for surface ships still hours away. He and his crew worked through the remaining daylight hours, pulling more than 50 men aboard the aircraft and lashing others to the wings with parachute cord. When the fuselage could hold no more, the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle, redirected toward the coordinates Gwynn had radioed in, arrived that night and became the first surface vessel on scene, using its searchlights to illuminate the water and begin the systematic recovery of survivors, a process that would continue through the following day as additional ships arrived to join the search. When the rescue operation was finally complete, the numbers made clear exactly what 4 days without a search had cost. Of the roughly 890 men who had gone into the water alive after the sinking, only 316 were pulled out alive. Combined with the estimated 300 killed in the initial attack, the total losses from USS Indianapolis reached 79 men, the largest single loss of life from one ship in the history of the United States Navy. It had taken a malfunctioning antenna wire and a pilot's chance glance out a window to find them. It had taken nothing at all from the system that was supposed to be looking. News of the disaster, once it reached Navy command, arrived at an almost impossibly sensitive moment. Japan would announce its intention to surrender within days. The atomic bombs that Indianapolis herself had helped deliver to Tinian had already been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States Navy, in the midst of what should have been a moment of total victory, now faced the uncomfortable task of explaining how it had lost track of one of its own heavy cruisers and nearly 900 of its own men for 4 full days. It would not take long for the Navy to settle on an explanation. It would take even less time to decide who, specifically, would be held responsible for it. News of the disaster reached Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters within days, and the Navy moved with unusual speed to control what the public would learn. The sinking was not announced until August 15, 1945. The same day Japan's surrender was formally announced, a timing that buried the story of the worst single loss of life in U.S. Navy history beneath the largest celebration of the war's end. Historians have long debated whether the delay was a deliberate act of news management or a byproduct of wartime security protocol. What is documented is the effect. A disaster that might have dominated headlines on its own instead arrived as a footnote to victory. But burying the announcement did not resolve the deeper problem sitting inside the Navy's own chain of command. Nearly 900 men were dead. A significant share of those deaths had occurred not during the attack itself, but during the 4 days adrift, waiting for a rescue that the Navy's own tracking failures had delayed. Congressional inquiry was a real possibility. Public confidence in the Navy's competence, at the exact moment it wanted to project total wartime mastery, was at risk. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations and the most powerful officer in the United States Navy, made the decision that would define the rest of this story. Rather than allow an extended public inquiry into the systemic tracking and communications failures that had left Indianapolis unfound for 4 days, the Navy would court-martial the one man whose name was already, unavoidably, attached to the loss of the ship, her commanding officer, Captain Charles B. McVay III. McVay was formally charged in November 1945 with 2 offenses: failing to zigzag his ship on the night of the attack, a maneuver intended to make a moving vessel harder for a submarine to target, and failing to give the order to abandon ship in a timely manner. Of the 2, it was the zigzag charge that the Navy chose to prosecute with the greatest force, and it was the charge that would prove, under scrutiny, to rest on the shakiest ground of the entire case. The court-martial convened at the Washington Navy Yard in December 1945, drawing national press attention at a moment when the country was eager to understand how such a disaster could have happened. The prosecution's case rested on a straightforward premise. Naval doctrine called for zigzagging in submarine-threatened waters as standard defensive practice. McVay had ordered his ship to travel in a straight line that night. And that decision, the Navy argued, had made Indianapolis an easier target for I-58's torpedoes. It was, on its surface, a coherent argument, the kind of institutional logic that made sense from the Navy's own point of view. Zigzagging was doctrine. McVay had discretion to order it and had not. A ship had been lost. Someone in command had made a decision, and that decision was now being weighed against the outcome. What the prosecution's case did not initially reckon with was a piece of evidence sitting 8,000 miles away in a Japanese naval officer's own memory of that night. Testimony that the Navy would soon find itself calling to the stand, from the one man on Earth who actually knew whether zigzagging would have mattered at all. The defense's case rested on a body of mitigating evidence that, taken together, painted a picture very different from the one the prosecution had presented. Evidence the court-martial board heard, weighed, and ultimately chose not to let outweigh the verdict it had already all but decided to reach. The most significant piece of that evidence concerned the weather itself. On the night of July 29th into July 30th, conditions in the area were documented as partly cloudy with intermittent haze, reducing visibility to the point that naval doctrine at the time gave commanding officers explicit discretion to suspend zigzagging when visibility was poor enough that the maneuver offered little defensive value. McVay's decision not to zigzag, under this reading of doctrine, was not a violation of standing orders. It was a judgment call made within the bounds of the authority his rank and command explicitly granted him, based on conditions his own bridge officers corroborated in their testimony. Compounding the weather issue was the matter of the intelligence McVay had never received. Naval investigators after the war confirmed that ultra-intercepts had flagged Japanese submarine activity along the exact route Indianapolis had been ordered to sail. Intelligence that, had it reached McVay before his departure from Guam, might have prompted him to request an escort more forcefully, alter his course, or take additional precautions. That intelligence never reached him. The officers who denied his escort request at Guam were themselves acting without full knowledge of the threat. McVay had been sent into a known danger zone that no one had told him was dangerous. Then came the testimony that should have settled the matter beyond reasonable dispute. The prosecution, in an unusual move, called Mochitsura Hashimoto, the very Japanese submarine commander who had sunk Indianapolis, to testify at the court-martial, apparently believing his account would strengthen the case against McVay. It did the opposite. Hashimoto testified, through an interpreter, that visibility that night had been more than adequate for his purposes regardless of the target's maneuvering, and that a zigzagging pattern would have made no meaningful difference to his ability to hit the ship. His spread of torpedoes, he stated plainly, would have found their mark whether Indianapolis had zigzagged or not. It was, by any reasonable evidentiary standard, the single most important piece of testimony in the entire proceeding. Direct evidence, from the only man who could actually know, that the specific act McVay stood accused of had no bearing whatsoever on the outcome. The court heard it. The court did not acquit. On December 19, 1945, the court-martial board found Captain Charles B. McVay III guilty of the charge of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. He was acquitted of the second charge, failing to order a timely abandonment of ship. His sentence, the loss of 100 numbers in his temporary promotion standing, effectively a demotion in seniority relative to his peers, was, by the standards of naval justice, comparatively light. Fleet Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the case afterward as Chief of Naval Operations, would later remit even that sentence entirely, restoring McVay's position, and Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal allowed McVay to remain in active service. But the formal leniency of the sentence would prove almost meaningless against what came next. McVay had been found guilty, in a public court-martial that dominated national headlines, of a specific and technical failure, hazarding his ship, that the very man who sank it had testified, under oath, made no difference at all. To the public that had followed the case in the newspapers, the nuance of remitted sentences and technical acquittals meant nothing. What registered was simpler and far more damning. The captain of USS Indianapolis had been court-martialed and found guilty for the loss of his ship, in the eyes of a grieving public looking for someone to hold accountable for 879 dead sailors. That verdict would follow Charles McVay for the rest of his life. To understand exactly how unusual McVay's court-martial was, It helps to look at the rest of the war around it, at the hundreds of American ships lost to enemy action across 4 years of global combat, and at how many of their commanding officers ever faced a court-martial for the loss. The number is, effectively, 1. Throughout the Second World War, the United States Navy lost hundreds of vessels to enemy submarines, aircraft, mines, and surface action, from destroyers torn apart in the opening months of the Pacific War to carriers sunk in the great fleet battles of Midway and the Philippine Sea. Ships were lost to ambush, to intelligence failures, to command decisions that in hindsight proved costly, to plain bad luck in a war fought across a hostile and unpredictable ocean. In case after case, naval boards of inquiry reviewed the circumstances, assigned institutional lessons where appropriate, and moved on without prosecuting the commanding officer for the simple fact of having lost his ship to the enemy. Losing a ship in combat was, by the Navy's own long-standing convention, treated as a hazard of war, not a court-martial offense, unless clear negligence rose to a level far beyond anything alleged against McVay. Indianapolis was different. Not because McVay's conduct was demonstrably worse than that of any other commander who lost a ship in the war. The evidentiary record, including the testimony of the man who sank her, suggested the opposite. It was different because of what surrounded the loss: a mission tied to the atomic bomb, a rescue delayed 4 days by the Navy's own tracking failures, a casualty count that made it the single deadliest sinking in the service's history, and a public, in the final days of the war, demanding to know how such a catastrophe had been allowed to happen. The Navy needed an answer. McVay was the answer it chose to give. The disproportion becomes starker still when set against the officers whose decisions had contributed directly to the disaster, and who never faced any formal proceeding at all. No officer at the Philippine Sea frontier was court-martialed for failing to flag Indianapolis as overdue. No radio officer was prosecuted for dismissing a genuine distress signal as a possible enemy trap. No intelligence officer answered publicly for the failure to relay ultra-intercepts about submarine activity along Indianapolis's exact route before she sailed. Internal Navy reviews acknowledged, in careful bureaucratic language, that failures had occurred at multiple points in the tracking and communications chain. Acknowledgement was, for those officers, effectively the end of the matter. Reprimands were issued to a handful of them, quietly, without public trial, without press coverage, without their names ever becoming attached to the disaster in the way McVay's name now permanently was. The contrast was not lost on the men who had survived the sinking, many of whom would spend the following decades arguing publicly that their captain had become a scapegoat for a system-wide failure that reached far beyond his bridge. It was not lost, either, on naval historians, who would later examine the case and arrive, with striking consistency, at the same conclusion: that McVay's prosecution had less to do with what he had actually done on the night of July 29th, and more to do with what the Navy needed the public to believe had happened. A single name, publicly punished, closed the story quickly. A full accounting of institutional failure, spanning intelligence compartmentalization, an outdated movement report system, and officers who ignored a legitimate distress call, would have taken much longer, and pointed in far more directions than the Navy was prepared to let it. Charles McVay had commanded his ship competently through years of war. He had survived a kamikaze strike, delivered the components of the atomic bomb on a record-setting timetable, and lost his ship to an attack that a Japanese submarine commander himself testified could not have been prevented by the maneuver McVay stood convicted of failing to perform. None of it mattered to the verdict that followed him home. What mattered was that the Navy needed one name attached to 879 deaths, and his was the only one available. The court-martial's remitted sentence restored Charles McVay's official standing on paper. It did nothing to restore what the public verdict had already taken from him. McVay returned to active duty following the trial, and was ultimately promoted to Rear Admiral, before retiring from the Navy in 1949, a career that, by the formal record, concluded honorably. But the formal record was never what the public remembered. What the public remembered was a court-martial, a guilty verdict, and 879 dead sailors, And for the families of those men, McVay's name became the fixed point onto which grief, unable to reach the distant and abstract failures of a bureaucratic tracking system, could finally attach itself. For the remainder of his life, McVay received letters from the families of Indianapolis' dead. Some were measured expressions of grief. Many were not. Survivors' relatives wrote to accuse him directly of killing their sons, their husbands, their brothers, blaming him personally for deaths that a Japanese submarine commander had testified, under oath, would have occurred regardless of any decision McVay made that night. Some letters arrived at Christmas, year after year, timed deliberately to reach him during the holiday season. McVay kept many of them. He answered some. He never publicly complained about receiving them. The Navy's own retired officers largely did not defend him publicly in these years. The institutional silence surrounding McVay's case was, in its own way, as damaging as the verdict itself. A court-martial that reduced a complicated, multi-layered institutional failure into the story of one man's mistake was once broadcast to a grieving public in December 1945. Not a story the Navy showed any institutional interest in complicating further. McVay's decline in his later years was not dramatic. It was quiet, and by most accounts, it was steady. He remarried after retirement, settled into a private civilian life in Connecticut, and by outward appearances maintained the composed bearing of a career naval officer well into his 60s. What friends and family described, in accounts given after his death, was a man who never stopped carrying the weight of the verdict, who spoke rarely of the sinking, and who, when he did, showed none of the outward defensiveness of a man convinced of his own innocence, but instead a private unresolved grief that never fully lifted. On November 6, 1968, at his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, Charles Butler McVay III died by suicide. He was 69 years old. He was found holding a toy sailor given to him as a child. A detail reported afterward by those close to him, offered without embellishment, because none was needed. He had commanded a heavy cruiser through some of the heaviest fighting of the Pacific War. He had delivered the components of the atomic bomb on a record-setting timetable that helped bring the war to its end. He had lost his ship to an attack that the enemy commander who carried it out testified, under oath, could not have been prevented by the maneuver he stood convicted of failing to perform. 23 years after that court-martial, the verdict was still the only part of the story that most of the country remembered. His death did not close the case. It would take more than 3 more decades, and the persistence of people who had never served under him, and had not yet been born when he died, before the verdict against Charles McVay would finally be reconsidered. For nearly 3 decades after McVay's death, the survivors of USS Indianapolis carried on a campaign that most institutional battles of this kind do not survive. They organized, beginning with reunions in the 1960s that continued annually for the rest of their lives. The dwindling number of men who had lived through those 4 days in the water used every reunion, every interview, and every available public platform to make the same argument consistently, for years, that their captain had been unjustly convicted, and that the record deserved to be corrected while any of them remained alive to see it. For most of those years, the campaign made little headway against an institution in no hurry to revisit a case it had considered closed since 1945. What ultimately broke that institutional inertia came from an unexpected source. In 1996, an 11-year-old 6th grader in Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott, began a school history project on the sinking of Indianapolis after watching the film Jaws, which references the disaster in a monologue. Scott's research led him to interview dozens of surviving crew members, and eventually to testify before the United States Congress, presenting a case for McVay's exoneration built substantially on the same evidence: the weather conditions, the missing intelligence, and Hashimoto's own testimony that had failed to move the original court-martial board 50 years earlier. The renewed attention, combined with decades of survivor advocacy and mounting historical consensus among naval historians that McVay's conviction had been a miscarriage of justice, finally reached Congress. In October 2000, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution stating that McVay's record should reflect that his court-martial conviction was unjust, and that the loss of Indianapolis was not a result of any negligence on his part, President Bill Clinton signed the resolution that same month. In July 2001, the Secretary of the Navy formally amended McVay's naval record to exonerate him, 56 years after the court-martial, 33 years after his death, and long after every officer who had sat on the original board had also passed away. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander whose testimony had failed to sway the court-martial board in 1945, lived to see the exoneration. He had written a letter to the United States government years earlier, supporting McVay's case and stating plainly that nothing the American captain could have done that night would have changed the outcome. He died in October 2000, just weeks after the Senate resolution passed, having spent the final years of his life advocating for the exoneration of the man commanding the ship he had sunk. The exoneration corrected the historical record. It could not undo what the intervening decades had already done to McVay himself, or to the families who had spent those same decades believing, because the Navy had told them to, that a single man's failure explained 879 deaths. What the case did leave behind was a documented, permanent lesson inside the institution that had failed to prevent it. The movement report system that failed to flag Indianapolis as overdue was overhauled in the years following the war, closing the specific gap that had allowed a combat vessel to disappear from official tracking without triggering any alarm. Procedures for handling distress signals were tightened, removing the ambiguity that had allowed 3 separate stations to receive Indianapolis's SOS and act on none of it. The case remains, to this day, a standard reference point in naval officer training on accountability, on the dangers of institutional compartmentalization, and on the distinction between assigning blame and understanding failure. USS Indianapolis is remembered, in the popular imagination, as a story about sharks in open water. The Navy's own record shows something else. A ship that vanished because a system built to prevent exactly that outcome failed at every link in its chain, and a captain who paid, for over half a century, the price of an institution's need to have someone to blame instead of something to fix.